Namaste, everybody. Welcome to all dear friends. Today, we are delighted and honored to have Pandit Satish Sharma ji, a stalwart of Dharma theology, Hindu philosopher, yoga acharya, and MD of the Global Hindu Federation. Awarded the title of Dharma Samrakshak, Pandit Satish K. Sharma is authorized to speak on the 6 darshans of Indian philosophy by the Council of the Hindu Swamis and Saints in Rishikesh. 2020 has been a year of, it's been a tumultuous year, first of all. It's been a year of the coronavirus. It has also been the year of George Floyd and the BLM riots. But for us, it has also been the year in the United States where for the first time, a caste discrimination case was filed by the state government of California against a Silicon Valley company. It was also the year when Oprah took a truckload of a book, a hurriedly written book called Caste, and she distributed it, a book that has become an instant bestseller, right? And it has also taken the book clubs by storm and become, defining conversations there. While many of us see Dharma and yoga and Veda and Gita when we hear the word Hindu, there is a section of society that will think of the tropes like caste, Dalit, and cow when they hear or think Hindu. Caste and Hinduism have existed as conjoined twins for a long time. But as most of us are realizing, caste is not even a Hindu word. It was a colonial imposition, and Pandit Sharma explores this in much detail with his new book, Caste, Conversions, a Colonial Conspiracy. With the still alliterative title, Pandit Sharma's book has educated us and addressed the root of the problem and offered a wonderful academic understanding. But may I also say that Pandit Sharma is a Dharma warrior, and he has fought this hydra-headed monster and caste case on the ground in the United Kingdom, and he has diffused what he calls the caste bomb in United Kingdom. In the US also, we need a similar surgical procedure because Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste and the Origin of Our Discontent, has arguably done more harm to both race and caste and to the countries of United States and India. No one, not Hindus, not Christians, not anyone else, can afford to ignore caste. It is everywhere. It's in the news, it's in media, in the workplace, it's defining our conversations in academic discussions. So without much ado, I will hand over the floor to our Dharma scholar, Pandit Sharma ji, to guide us, to educate us, and reveal caste and the true origin of its discontent. Thank you so much, and welcome, Pandit Sharma. Pranam. So delighted to have you.
Pranam, namaskar, Ruchi, and also namaskar to the rest of the CoHNA family. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we start, if I can just share a mantra with you, which is really important for us.
Satishji, if I may interrupt, my apologies. Your voice is slightly low. If you can speak up.
Is that any better now?
Great.
Okay, wonderful. My apologies for that. So we have got a phenomenal piece of technology trying to pull this whole thing together with yourselves over in various parts of the US. We have people from India and here in Europe as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some odd lags here and there, and I would ask the audience's forgiveness and patience with us. I was just going to say that this journey that we're going to go on today is an exploration of Satya, of the reality today, and also the reality in the past. And we have a wonderful mantra from the Rig Veda, which is Asatoma Sat Gamaya Tamsoma Jyotir Gamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Guru Bhyo Namaha. And so this mantra says that may we move from asat, which is untruths or that which is not real, towards satya, an understanding, a darshan of the reality. And there are very few things which are so prevalent and yet based in complete asat as the caste idea the caste concept, and the caste history. Now, what I'm going to do is to place this in a context which is really important to understand. It's not enough anymore to understand that caste doesn't feature in the Sanatani scriptures. It's not enough to understand that all of our teachings from Adi Shankaracharya, the Advait and Dvait philosophy is about us being Atma. And we have the capacity to look beyond Nam and Roop and look at the Tattva of a human being. None of that helps us to really fully appreciate what this caste concept is and how do we deal with it. Because deal with it, we must, we have to. By way of an introduction and also a bit of background, I had never anticipated writing a book, nor indeed needing to write a book. My personal opinion is that the earth has never been so weighed down with the weight of paper and literature as she is at this moment in time. And everything that is worth writing is pretty much already written for a person on an adhyatmic journey. And so to add to that burden and weight was not something I ever wanted to do. The other thing is I never dreamt that I would publish a book or write a book on the subject of caste. So both of these are strange occurrences, but they were necessitated by events here in the United Kingdom. I had a very quiet and relatively peaceful traditional Hindu existence, doing my own thing, looking after the family, and doing my own sadhana and my own research, my own personal experiences. But in 2013, I encountered the caste ideology here in the UK from the point of view of government. The government started to talk about caste. In 2013, they started to talk about caste, then it went quiet. In 2015, the conversation started. And then in 2016, caste became center stage because parliamentarians started to insist that caste was a problem in the UK, that Hindus were discriminating against each other on a daily basis in public sphere, in the public sector, and that this was so terrible that we had to have legislation to prevent it from continuing. This was totally different to my own lived experience of having been in the United Kingdom for over 50 years and having worked with mandirs up and down the country and with many of our community organizations, and I had never come across an instance of caste discrimination as was being painted and the charge was leveled against us. So I needed to understand what was going on. One thing I did understand from the outset was that if caste was put into law, it would be creating in law a presumed hierarchy. It would be telling people that Hindus actually believe that there is a hierarchy. And because there's a hierarchy, these terrible Hindus inflict supremacist ideas on each other. And we needed Her Majesty's government to protect the poor Hindus who were being discriminated against. This was a recipe for disaster. And so that's the point at which I started to go back and to try and understand what was happening, why was this done to us, and what did we need to do to challenge this issue and to also preserve the harmony and integrity and the coherence of our community. So this was not something that I wanted to do, but it was thrust upon us. I could see the problems that it would generate. And that's when I came across the notion, which I've now termed as a caste bomb. And I'm going to bring the idea of a caste bomb to everybody to have a thought about and to become familiar with it, because caste is something that we are all going to encounter, and the caste bomb is going to be leveraged against us. Our children are going to encounter it, and in fact, once I've identified it and you see the strategy at play, you'll start to recognize how the caste bomb has been used against the Hindu community for such a long period of time. And it will continue to be used against us because there are advantages to certain groups for this caste concept to be sustained, to be proliferated, to be nurtured, and for the conflict that it causes in our Hindu community to be maintained. And so I'm going to start with a little introduction as to what this caste bomb actually is. Now, I'm going to share with you a small video. I hope the sound and everything else is okay. We will try this. It worked in testing. Hopefully we'll be blessed with success. But here's my first experience of the caste bomb in action. So I was invited to participate on the BBC's flagship religious interfaith program called The Big Questions. And so I attended as a representative of the Hindu community, and the subject was, did man create God, or did God create man? Philosophically, intelligent, wise people coming together to talk about this conundrum. Nothing to do with caste at all. And yet what transpired is in itself educative. So I'm now going to move to the screen for our small presentation, and I hope everybody can see this.
So you throw that one in. Yeah, absolutely. But the notion of the mystical experience has primacy with us. Once a person's had a mystical experience, then you recognize that actually that mystical experience represents itself in a gender-free environment. Our tradition tradition, 5,000 years, we would say a lot more than 5,000 years, we have never had a theocracy in India. And that's because of the multiplicity, the pure democracy of how you wish to engage
like the caste
with
system.
divinity. Well, caste is a Portuguese word, and like all words, words have concepts behind them. There is no word in the Indian Sanskrit or indeed the Hindu vocabulary for caste. I would share with you that caste is something that was exported to India, and it has no place in the Indian scriptures.
Still got it, though.
Nor indeed practice.
In a minute, Cole. Ara.
Yeah,
And so there you saw an example of the caste bomb. If there's a Hindu present and a conversation is being conducted, if you want to undermine or derail the credibility, the dignity, or indeed the success of anything a Hindu is presenting, you toss in the caste bomb. It's used regularly, and it is something that has a terrible impact upon our community. Let me share with you another example of how terrible this is. Our children, when they're at school, if they are being educated or participating in a religious education class, inevitably they are introduced to the caste bomb. No matter what happens, no matter what the conversation is, oh, but you Hindus have the caste system. And what it does is it undermines us. So the first thing that I'd like everyone to appreciate is the existence of this caste bomb as a concept. Now, if I can share with you one or two little slides which I've put together to hopefully communicate a slightly different understanding. Here is, I hope everybody can see this. So these are my contact details, and they'll be available later anyway. But this is what happened only last year. Isabel Wilkerson and Oprah, they introduced two huge caste bombs into our life. Up until that moment in time, things were not too complicated. We had dealt with the caste issue. In the UK, we had managed to defeat those people who were saying that this was a problem for our community. And we had educated so many of our own Hindus to the stage where they had understood that caste is not something that we should be ashamed of, that it was imposed upon us using force. And so we had settled this issue in the United Kingdom. But when this happened, suddenly it became apparent that the caste bomb, the brigade who used this, had moved their focus from the United Kingdom to the United States. The Cisco case is the first example of how the caste bomb was deployed. And the issue with these caste bombs is that unless you know how the framework has been constructed, unless you know how to deconstruct that framework and create your own framework for presenting our situation and our position, we can't defeat the caste bomb. So it's vitally important that our community understand why this works the way it works. So to do that, I'd like to share with everybody a brief timeline to put this into context. Now, this is courtesy of a dear friend of mine, Sri Nilesh Okji, who has put together a historical timeline and managed to very successfully pinpoint certain events on our civilizational timeline. So we can go back as far as 18,000 BCE at this moment in time with geographical and geophysical evidence of an existing civilization. The Ramayana has been dated at 12,209 BCE, the Mahabharata some 7,000 years ago, 5156 BCE, and then we come to the modern date. And the modern time frame that we're in is actually just this little tail end here. Now, this is important to understand because for the period prior to this, there is no mention anywhere, nor any sanction of something called caste, which would be a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous social structure. It didn't exist for that best part of 20,000 years. And then in this tiny little period here, something changed. What changed? The British came to India and there was an incredible colonization initiative, the depth of which, the intensity of which, the integrity of which we have never suspected. We've never really understood how detailed, how pernicious, and how determined their attempts were to destroy the fabric of Bharat. Now, in the book, I go into great detail with quotations from English sources, from parliamentary sources, from Hansard, and from records of colonial times to prove that, in fact, this was a deliberate intention of the British, and it was intended to stay there embedded in our psyche for as long as possible. One of the things that we need to understand is that in that period when the British were going out to colonize the world from this tiny island, the psyche and the personality and the mentality of the British was very, very different to the mentalities that we had encountered. Now, there is one aspect of this flow which I think would be worth realizing. A civilization develops generation after generation, and it learns lessons, and it explores the environment around itself, and it explores its own self. And those lessons are stored within identity. An identity is a civilizational creation. A mother will teach everything she has learned to her children. A father will teach everything he has learned to his children. And slowly, generation after generation, we develop a refined, civilized understanding of what it is to be a human being. So we have an identity which goes back, its evolution and its refinement goes back at least 18,000 years. And this identity is what is the most valuable inheritance of our Sanatani community. This identity is what is embedded into the landscape of Bharat. It's the identity which infuses the temples, the dance, the literature, the Yoga Vidya, the Ayurveda Vidya, the Vidya about the world and about the cosmos around us. All of those are infused into the land of Bharat, and it is the identity itself which is the most incredible inheritance and the treasure that we have. So we have an identity which goes an awful long time, spanning this 18,000 period. Now, if you try and find records of the identity of the Europeans, and especially the British for that period, there is nothing there. It will be a wonderful exploration to use Purvapaksh to try and establish exactly what the identity is which has fueled this country, fueled Great Britain, fueled the British. Now, when the British came to Bharat, they found an identity, a civilizational understanding of existence, which was so vastly superior to everything they had ever encountered that it threatened their power structures. It threatened their sense of self, and they were confronted with one of two choices. They had to make a choice. One is to acknowledge that everything that the ruling classes in Britain, the royalty and the church, had been teaching the British people was a lie, because here was a much better, much more refined, much more civilized, civilizational identity. They had that choice, and that would have meant the end of the British nobility, the British structure, the British class structure. So what they decided to do was to continue raping and pillaging and stealing from Bharat and destroying its essence, and at the same time to destroy this ancient, civilized Bharatiya identity. this identity is what has always been the target of the barbarian forces which came to Bharat. They needed to destroy it. And as we go along, we will see that caste is in fact, a caste bomb is in fact a mechanism to destroy, to undermine, to help deconstruct, and to humiliate the Bharatiya civilizational identity. And that's how it's being used today. The situation is exactly the same today as it was in prehistory before 1947, in that even today, the European and the Christian traditions are faced with a terrible option. If Bharat is successful in standing on its own 2 feet, reasserting its civilizational identity, and it starts to tell the world the true history of what happened when Britain came to Bharat, Britain as a nation which has never reconciled itself to its past, will have to do that. And so what we will see is throughout the world, throughout the English-speaking Christian world, we will see caste being talked about in every avenue, in every corner. Just bear in mind, right now, at this moment in time, almost in every person's mind, you can go to a remote place. I'll give you an example. I was in Charlottesville a few years ago, a tiny little town in America, and I went to have a haircut. Yes, I had a full head of hair in those days. And I was chatting with the hairdresser, and she didn't really know much about British geography. But when I told her about, oh, I'm an Indian and we're Hindus, and she said, oh, yes, talk to me about the caste system. I've always wondered. So there is a reason why this one word exists in the consciousness of pretty much every Christian and pretty much every European, and it's not by accident, it's by design. This word has been proliferated, and it's going to continue to be proliferated because it acts as an impediment to our own cohesive society, to recovering our own civilizational integrity and healing the wound that caste has created. So be ready for this. The caste bomb is very real. So in that time that I've mentioned, this time frame here, the British had created the most amazing propaganda machine to cover up what they had actually learned and what they were doing. They needed to cover up the crime scenes, the colonial crime scenes, and paint a story that colonized nations would buy, but they also needed to cover up what they were doing in the colonies from their own British people. They needed the British to accept, the British general population to accept that actually what the British were doing out in the world was a wonderful thing, that they were superior and the rest of the world were barbaric. So there was a lying, a need for lies, deceit, and propaganda like never before. Now I'm going to share with you a couple of examples. One of the greatest lies ever told is to be born an Indian is to belong to a caste. Most Hindus even accept this. Most Indians accept this, and this is a lie. It was never the case with us. And let me share with you the lengths that they went to create lies. Most people will have known that in the First and Second World War, an awful lot of Hindus, Indians, Bharatiyas contributed in terms of manpower, in terms of assets, in terms of resources, in terms of natural resources, metal, etc. Vast, vast quantities. Now it's worth considering, why was it that that was done? How did they manage to leverage and influence so many people to engage in a war on the other side of the world? How was that done? And so this was a question I asked, and I came across a place called Crew House, which really was the lie factory. This is where lies were generated. Now in Hansard, May the 23rd, 1917, Mr. Ronald McNeill asked the Prime Minister if the Prime Minister will take steps to make it known as widely as possible in Egypt, India, and the East especially, that the Germans use the dead bodies of their own soldiers and of their enemies when they obtain possession for them as food for swine. Okay, so they were spreading the rumor, and this is a lie, and it's acknowledged as a lie in the records of Crew House. They were spreading the lie that Germans were actually using the dead bodies of own soldiers and other soldiers and they were grinding these bodies down and giving them to pigs to be fed as food. This is just one example. And here in this record in Parliament, you see there was a conscious, determined effort to spread in India the idea that there was such a vile enemy in Germany who was doing such atrocious, horrific things that they too needed to get involved. Now, this is an example of how thorough and how determined and how competent, tragically, Crewe House, the Life Factory, was. And this is also one of the locations where the propaganda about Bharat was used. So this is how lies were adopted as state policy. And this is something that I think most of our community should understand, that in the past, Bharat, which has Satyam Evam Jayate on its national, is its national motto, encountered a civilization which believed in Asat Evam Jayate, a total opposite view of world life and existence. So this idea of the caste bomb is an idea which says that a lie was created, it was perpetuated, it was sustained, and it was proliferated, and then it was refined to be able to be deployed at any time and immediately undermine a civilization. This is called a trope. Now, a caste trope was created. And what a trope is it's an idea that doesn't need any explanation. It's a negative stereotype. It's an idea which everybody knows already without actually knowing in detail, but they will respond to in a predetermined manner. And there were many tropes that were created in the history of Europe and in the history of Christianity. I will share with you two tropes. One was the trope that the Jews killed Jesus. Now, this was a trope that was proliferated, and we know the suffering that the Jewish people went through at the hands of Christian nations and civilizations. Another trope, if I can give you an example, is the Shakespearean trope of Shylock, the Jew, who was a nasty creature, who was built, the identity was built around the notion of somebody, a banker, a Jewish banker, who was so unpleasant that they would even extricate a pound of flesh to settle a financial debt. That was a trope, and for a long period of time, the Jewish community were vilified as being Shylock. Most people, when they think of Shylock, they now recognize that actually that was a trope. But not too long ago, this trope was very successful in vilifying the Jewish community. So that's the nature of a trope. Now, this lying civilization of the 1917, well, it was a period from about 1820 right the way through to 1930, that this lying factory was very, very active. And its attention in Bharat produced the most powerful trope, and that trope is the caste trope. And the caste bomb is how it's deployed. Now that you know where that comes from, I'd like you to have a look at the notion of what was done with Isabel Wilkerson and indeed Oprah. So we have a situation in the UK where we had defeated the attempt to leverage this caste bomb against the British Hindu community. And we were quite tranquil and we thought, great, done. It wasn't until this issue arose, this book was created, and Isabel Wilkerson and Oprah deployed the caste bomb against our community, that I decided that a rebuttal was necessary. And so I published our book, the book which is the subject of today's talk. And the purpose of that book is to diffuse this caste bomb. Let me share with you a little bit of how Isabel Wilkerson and Oprah have done this to us. And please be in no doubt, this book that Isabel Wilkerson has published and that Oprah has leveraged and publicized and deployed, it harms our community. It harms our attempts to decolonize ourselves. It harms our efforts to recover from over 280 years of the most barbaric suffering at the hands of British colonialists. And so it's particularly unpleasant that a community, the African American community, which is involved in its own process of decolonization, would choose to try and advance their own cause, but to do it by proliferating another colonialist trope. Now, I've studied the book, I've read the book from cover to cover, and it's a tragedy. If I was asked to describe this book, This is a classic example of two things. One is it's a classic example of confirmation bias. Isabel Wilkerson went to the Indian caste system with preconceived ideas, and she found things which suited her existing bias, assumed that what she knew was already true, and wrote her book, never thinking for a moment that actually she may be mistaken and that her research was quite shallow. Confirmation bias runs through this. And the other is the quality of research is so poor. For somebody who is being spoken of as a Booker Prize winner, etc., etc., this book is a terrible example of research. If I turn to Oprah, I mean, Oprah has a phenomenal platform. And if you have such a platform and you're going to have a conversation which touches upon the suffering of another former colonial country, then you really need to do your research. And I'm confident that had Oprah had a bit of advice, she could have employed 100 people to go and find out and do the research, which is nothing more than what I did. I did this research in a two-year period. She could have done this in 2 or 3 months and checked whether what she was doing was valid, thorough, research, and even gathered a little bit of feedback about the potential consequences. Had that been done, this book in its current form, which harms the most ancient, continuing existent civilization on the planet, would never have been published in its current form. And I'm reaching out to the authors and the publishers to engage in a conversation, because as I have said, this book harms us, and the harm that's done to us does need to be acknowledged, and some path towards reparation and to repairing the harm needs to be established. I would look forward to an opportunity to engage with Isabel Wilkerson. This book is a problem for us, and we need to address this. The book that I have produced does actually challenge, rebut, and successfully reset the understanding of what caste is. And I would suggest that everybody should have a read of it at the earliest opportunity. This issue, we have understood its history. We've understood a little bit about the tropes. We've understood the manner in which it was deployed against us and the consequences, the ongoing consequences of allowing this caste bomb to be deployed again and again. But we have to work out, how do we respond to this? There is a fundamental understanding which everybody should now have, and that is that we do not have the choice not to engage with this issue. We have always been quiet. We have always been subconsciously a little bit guilty that maybe there's truth, and maybe our ancestors were guilty of this terrible caste system. And so we have instinctively avoided it. But that option no longer exists now. There is a determined movement who are so committed to ensuring that their 200-year-old investment in the creation of a hate brand which has undermined Bharat again and again and again is not to be compromised. If we do not act, they will continue to use this. They will continue to make our children feel uncomfortable. They will continue to create a rift between members of our own Dharmic Sanatani family who have over a long period of time been told that they are actually oppressed by their own brethren. And this is how powerful this caste trope is. If we do not take control of this, it will continue to harm us. It will harm our own community, it'll harm the next generation of children, and it'll harm subsequent generations. So number one, please accept that we do not have a choice. We need to do something about this. This is of key importance. So with the report, I wanted to put together in an easy mechanisms for people to understand that caste discrimination is alien to the Indian view of existence. I wanted to establish the reality of exactly when and how the caste concept was created. 4th of January 1844 was the first time it was successfully conceptualized, agreed, and deployed. I wanted to identify who benefits from nourishing and sustaining the whole caste discrimination ideology. Now, when you understand the propaganda factory and how it works, what the propaganda factory always does is it looks to recruit and prepare what in, I think, espionage terms are called useful idiots. Now, these are genuine, good-hearted people who don't have access to vast research, who are relatively innocent and naive and easily motivated to act against their own brethren, their own family, their own community, their own tradition. These are people who are easily radicalized. And what I wanted to do was to create a body, an easily accessible body of knowledge, which anybody can access, including those of our own family who are fighting amongst themselves because of what they have been told. And we have a story in our Panchtantra about two brothers, two dogs who were brothers, and how every day they would be given one roti, one chapati by a lady who used to look after them. And every day they would tear it in half and share the food together. And one day a hungry monkey saw them on a tree and was determined to try and get hold of their food. And so he intervened. And by intervening, he said, well, one half's bigger than the other. Let me just break it in half for you. And he tore it in half. And in doing so, one half was bigger than the other half. And so he said, let me just have a nibble at this half so they're both the same size. Oh dear, I've nibbled it too much. Let me have a nibble at the other half and make them the both sides. And within a few minutes, you know what happened. The chapati, the roti was gone. This story teaches us another principle, and that is the intervention of a third party who has a conflict of interest with our own community. Now, please recognize this. This is very important. This caste issue has been harming the Sanatani family for a long, long period of time. And the first step we have to take is recognize the existence of third parties for whom this is a conflict of interest. And so strategically, I'm going to make a recommendation to you. If it's a white person wanting to talk to us about caste, they have no right. There was a colonialist attitude which assumed the white Christians had a superior vision, and as white saviors, they were saving our souls and making us less uncivilized. History and the commonly accepted accounts of colonialism establish that that was wrong. And so the first thing we need to recognize is that white people have no place in a conversation with us. We don't need white saviors anymore pointing out our community's flaws. So the first thing we have to do is respond to them. And rather than talking about caste, let's engage them in a conversation about white supremacy, about the history of the atrocities inflicted by white supremacists on people who are non-white. That's an important conversation. If Christian members want to talk to us about this particular issue, again, we have no need for Christian saviors. We need to be able to say to them, thank you, but no thank you. We'd much rather speak to you, perhaps about the doctrine of discovery, whereby Christianity assumed that most human beings who were non-Christians didn't have souls. They were animals, beasts of burden, and could be treated as such. They could be deprived of their lands. They could be deprived of their knowledge. Everything could be taken from them, and you could enslave them and kill them without consequence, and it was divinely sanctioned. Now, that's a better conversation for Sanatanis to be having with members of the Christian family, rather than continuously being on the receiving end of subliminal criticism. Now, in the same way that that monkey was consuming the roti, we should recognize that intervention by third parties has not helped. There's a rift in our family, it's caused by third parties, and it's been perpetuated by our own members because we didn't understand what was done to us. We can heal it, but in order to heal it, we need to control the boundary of who has this conversation with us. So when Cisco representatives or lawyers or legislators in the United States want to have this conversation, we should also understand that there is a requirement for us to have a conversation about the manner in which European Christians decimated 100 million native indigenous residents of the United States. That's a conversation worth having, and it will reset the artificial dynamic of who has a superior and a natural right to the moral high ground. And let's have a conversation from a much healthier perspective of equals wanting genuine benefits and genuine healing for everybody. So this is really an important idea. This issue of caste is a mimetic virus. It communicates from person to person and it infects people. And like most tropes, its solution is in understanding. So we have to understand it and we have to start to remove this mimetic virus from human awareness. The solution to the caste problem is not legislation which enshrines the concept of caste into law, but it's dissolving caste consciousness. Our system, our Sanatani system of Varna, of Jati, of Kul, Bradri, of Gotra, all of these things are so much more refined and so much more understanding of the way in which human beings can coexist. We have that to contribute to the West. They need to learn it from us. We need them to learn it from us. Otherwise, humanity's progression is going to become even more frictions. So, imagine an India free of the concept of caste. Imagine fluidity between Varna, which is exactly what existed literally before the British arrived. If you read works like Dharmpalji's The Beautiful Tree, where he talks about the education system, there is more than enough evidence that we had fluidity between Varnas. We had fluidity between Kul. These were all based on merit, and that needs to be restored because they are dharmic realities, they're dharmic truths. This is important for us. In conclusion, so that we can move to the Q&A, I'm going to make a couple of suggestions. What do we do about this? I said that we have to take control over this rhetoric. It's not enough for you to have listened to what I've spoken about and feel, oh, we've learned something today, and not act on it. We need to act. And what can we do in terms of acting? I would suggest that we organize caste bomb conversations, gather a few family members together, maybe in mandirs, actually create an event whereby this subject can be spoken about. We need to take control of this narrative, and our voice has been missing from this narrative. Organize workshops on how to challenge and how to respond when the caste bomb is thrown at you. Let's teach our children, this is going to happen to you. It's out there, people are talking about it, and here's the reality of how you respond to it. Work out the strategies. Let's make sure this happens. Train our children to have these debates, and just think, in the process of teaching them how to have these debates, we actually move them into a space where they're naturally proud of their ancestors and what their ancestors have bequeathed to us. We teach them how to engage in debates from a position of tranquility, but with skill and with command over language and with nuance and command over frameworks, and how to engage professionally to come to a successful outcome, an outcome where we win, where we succeed. Now, if we put our act together, decide to do something about this caste concept, we decide to formally and with skill create projects, create events, I would suggest that within a 24-month period, this caste concept, which has been plaguing our community ever since the British wielded it, this caste concept can be relegated to the dustbin of history, which is where it belongs. The choice is really our own choice. We can make this happen, we can do this. And just think, since 1844, this concept has been deployed against us and we've never gotten rid of it. Now's the time for us to get rid of it. And when we do get rid of it, our children can actually continue their journey of being Sanatanis, standing tall and literally growing as dharmic human beings on the earth and picking up the evolution of our identity, continuing with it, refining it even further, so that the identity of our civilization moves into its next stage. And we then repair the problems of the minor temporary break which occurred with first 800 years of Islamist invasion, followed by almost 300 years of Christianist invasion. That interrupted the evolution of our identity. We can fix this. It's not complicated. The book contains everything that's necessary for us to be able to do it and to start this conversation. But ultimately, we need to make sure that the word caste is as corrosive, is as toxic. It needs to be a word that we possess ownership of, in the same way that the African American community have taken possession of the colonialist trope which was directed to destroy and to humiliate their community, the N-word. caste is our N-word, and we need to make sure that we get it to that particular place. Once that's done, we can then continue our journey. So we have got the challenges there in front of you. We've got some great opportunities to do this. And I'm now going to hand back to our organizers with gratitude and appreciation to you all for having listened to my conversation. And we'll take some questions and answers.
Panditji, namaste.
Namaste.
As always, it was right on point and lots of things that you always bring out. We do have some questions that I would like to go with. The first question is, can you explore the intersection between profound poverty and caste? You know, this is one of the, again, one of the things that always is brought up by various types of people, our own people as well as the Western world, that, you know, caste is responsible for poverty and poverty is responsible for caste. You know, it's a combination of these things. So if you can maybe talk about that.
Sure. So wonderful question. And thank you for whoever submitted that question. It was a great place to start. Let me share with you a couple of ideas. Firstly, every time you use the word caste and accept it as a reality, we're falling into the trap. The trap is that caste is a part of our ancestry, our heritage, and therefore the solution lies within this concept of caste. It doesn't. We have to discard it. Now, let me just wind the clock back. When the British arrived, there were some 600 kingdoms, 607 kingdoms, I think, principalities and kingdoms in Bharat. And of those, 400 plus were ruled by Shudra kings. So just consider that for a moment. Shudra kings were responsible for protecting, for nurturing, for guiding, sustaining and maintaining law and order and wealth and well-being in Bharat. Rani Rajmohini in Kolkata, the prince, the queen who built Dakshineshwar Mandir, was a Shudra queen. And so the transition of asset wealth from Bharatiyas over to the British, the largest movement of assets occurred from the Shudra communities to the British. When the British left, the Shudra community had been devastated. 45 trillion pounds worth was the loss to Bharat. And that money is really the key factor as to why Bharat is poor. Now, I would suggest that the British, who were so skillful in telling their stories, and I'll share a story about Ravan and his Mayavi capacities if I have the opportunity, that having stolen it, they did what any thief will do, and that is to cover it up with lies. So having stolen the theft, they use the divide and rule principles to say, oh, you're poor because those people have deprived you of those assets. In the book, I disclose the notion and the research that there were 13 million people who were living concentration camp lives in Bharat in 1947. Those 13 million were confined to conditions of such poverty, and they are the classes who became the Dalit classes, the classes who called themselves Dalits. But if you trace their history goes back to being some of the most strident, ardent challengers of British rule. And that is why the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, for example, converted successful, strong communities who were very affluent into poverty-stricken criminal tribes. So there is a link between poverty and caste, but there is no link between poverty, Varna, Jati, Kul, and Baradri. And it's really important that we recognize what was done to those communities who call themselves Dalits, because they are oppressed. They were oppressed. All I'm suggesting is that the cause of their descent, the source of their discomfort and everything, was not Sanatan Dharma. It was not those terrible Kshatriyas, those hateful Brahmins, etc., etc. The roots are actually much closer to home and much more recent. So yes, we can redress this, but we have to get rid of caste consciousness. We have to get rid of the notion of hereditary hierarchy. That's a terrible notion. It's completely against meritocracy, which is what Sanatan Dharma has always preached.
Great, yes. And just to add to the Criminal Tribes Act, actually, I was doing some research, and there is actually a paper out there that talks about the whole thing. 100 million people alive today have been subjected to this issue of poverty and a destruction. because of the Criminal Tribes Act that was passed by the British. So it's it's a huge blow to our society. So fully agree with you on that. The next question is, it's an interesting one. We all grapple with this. How do you deal with Indians who seem to thrive on perpetuating this trope, right? So you have Indian people, both people who are saying, hey, you know what, I'm a Brahmin, I'm a superior guy or whatever. Or you have those people who are so-called Indians, right, who like to say, you know what, Indian society or Hindu dharma is nothing but casteism, right? So how do you deal with both those types of people?
Perfect. One, again, a superb question. My compliments to the quality of your audience. So let's just look at that a little bit deeper. Firstly, this idea of our community and its current frame of mind. We are a community which has been civilizationally traumatized for at least 12 generations. We've had 12 generations of people working upon our community to create divide and rule policies, to extort taxation, to steal wealth. And remember, each of these civilizations, as they're called, these colonialist civilizations, they came to Bharat not because it was poor, not because it was ugly, not because it was uncivilized. They came attracted to the wealth and beauty, both artha, but also vidya. They came for knowledge and they came to steal wealth. Now, that knowledge and that wealth came about because human beings had learned how to work together without this nonsense of hierarchy based upon a purely social structure. They had worked out that the highest level of human attainment was actually adhyatmic, that a person's measure was on the basis of their spiritual progression and their evolution as a human being, their capacity to inspire people with a word, to nourish compassion with a gesture, all of these noble parts of a human being. Those were what elevated a person in our society. And if you read early accounts of travelers and visitors to Bharat, they will talk about the nobility in the lowest, the occupations which are the simplest, lowest in terms of wealth, but they will talk about the simplicity and the purity of the people across the strata. And so we have to, one, accept that our community is not to be blamed for their social problems. We are to be blamed if we assume that they are what our community and our Shastra teach us. That's a problem. But let's start from the point of view that we are recovering from civilizational trauma. Let's accommodate those people who think they're higher and those people who think they're lower for whatever reasons, and remind them that Sanatana Dharma is not built on this ideology. We need to remind them that if they really are higher, then in many respects, their ego will be the lowest. Their separation, their notion that they are separate from a Bharatiya family is a flawed concept. It's a colonialist meme. We need to get rid of it. And this is something that needs to be done by those with the authority and the power and the courage to do this compassionately. I would love to have debates with Brahmins who say we're superior. Oh, I'd love to have that conversation and disempower them to some degree, or to educate them and remind them of what their kul responsibility is. It's not to dominate. It's not to strut around in illusory feathers. It's not to be the king with the emperor's clothes. It's to nurture humanity. What a Brahmin is supposed to do is to be the most compassionate and the most knowledgeable, and try and get wisdom to come out of every single human being and elevate them according to what Paramatma may have destined them for. This is a job that needs to be done. And I think there is sufficient in the book. I do reach out to each of the communities with an invitation that they need to engage with this issue. We need to have the Dalit community restored and reconnected to its ancestral lineages. They were amazing lineages. We have a great deal to be proud of with them. And we need to connect the Brahmins to their traditional lineages so they too can undo this conditioning, this planted way of thinking. It's a klesh. There's no other way to describe it. This understanding is ridden with klesh, and no genuine Sanatani would allow klesh to cause them to make their life choices.
Absolutely. And there are so many great things, like chapter 18 of the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita really talks about this whole thing, idea like, this and that. So many passages in the Gita and so many other places talk about the qualities of a Brahmin, qualities of the Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, etc. And I would say if people follow just that part, right, it will change so many of the dynamics that we see today. Unfortunately, we have stopped following those teachings, and we are seeing the result today, right? So the klesha part is beautifully put, Panditji.
I would say one thing which everybody should take away, and that is if somebody says I'm higher and he's lower, or whatever interpretation of the caste system, what's the metric you're going to use to measure it? If a Brahmin is saying I'm higher, then genuinely that height, what do we measure it in? It should be higher in knowledge, fine, in which case they will be lower in terms of their lack of mental personal evolution, right? In sense of his ego will be diminished to a negligible amount. So what's the metric? There's only one metric which universally applies whenever you're talking about caste, and I've mentioned it in the book. High in the British sense was a high caste. It represents a high threat level to the British colonialist mission, and a low caste represented the lowest threat level to the colonialist mission. And that's how they sculpted the caste hierarchy in Bharat.
Absolutely. And there's so much evidence, like you bring out in your book, about the dates that you mentioned, the British census, the whole idea of essentializing this one feature that may be existing in one part of the country as the defining feature and making it the trope, like you mentioned. So, but unfortunately, what has happened is, and this is going to the next question, because of this colonial mentality, the colonial infrastructure, it has been embedded in the Indian Constitution, right? So today, the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribes, all these words that were used by the British have made it into official constitutional framework of the Indian Constitution, right? So how can India get away from that when it is intrinsically part of the government policies in form of reservation and other, sort of like denominations, if you want to call it, within the system?
It's again a wonderful question, and that conversation is underway in Bharat now. And I think everybody recognizes that the meritocracy-based environment is the only environment in which human beings flourish. If you put your efforts into elevating yourself, you have a natural entitlement to the rewards that flow. So reservations on the basis of economic status is a wonderful idea. But when it comes to reservations on the basis of a colonialist trope, that's guaranteed to destroy a society's recovery. If those people who have had in their family lineages access to vidya are prevented from becoming powerful, you can guarantee that that society is going to struggle. If you place power in the hands of those groups and communities who are purely politically motivated, or they want to acquire wealth, etc., that's the nature of the society that you're going to get. So we have to look at who is preserving these Shastra, who has preserved many of the palm scripts, who has got the Vidya, the Charak Samhita, and let's empower those people according to their capacity to rebuild the communities and societies. It's wrong to take a Brahmin Pujari's son who works day and night to study and say you have to jump over a much higher hurdle than somebody else whose family are ministers and who are driving around in air-conditioned chauffeur-driven vehicles. That's an injustice. And anybody who genuinely wants justice will want justice for all. If they want justice for themselves because politically that's what their demand is, and they're happy that other people are on the receiving end of injustice, then this is adharma. And that will, without doubt, it'll come back as in suffering.
Absolutely. Now, some people say that the idea of caste, not the colonial word itself, but the idea of discrimination or untouchability, etc., has been around for at least 1,000 plus years, because it's mentioned in different places. They always bring out, again, the tropes about the Manusmriti or this Smriti or that text or whatever it is, and then say, look, see, here it is. There are practices of untouchability that are sanctioned in the Shastras. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I look forward to having that conversation. In fact, I'm going to do a recording on Manusmriti. Most people will possibly recall that I said that the time when, give me a second, I'm just looking for it. Excellent. So this particular time period in history is a time period that we need to have a look at. This time period, this little red circle, was the time when the maximum amount of harm was done to Bharat. This is the time when we had people like Mills, who was given the job in the United Kingdom to write the British history of India, the history of British India. He'd never visited the country. He was given a 3-year commission to create propaganda with no other purpose than to try and conceal what they had done and to justify it by elevating themselves and diminishing Bharat's history. That was the period when the interpolation of shlokas into our Shastra and scriptures was done, and it was done deliberately. It's recorded, and it's absolutely essential that we understand that to be the case. There's already a great deal of work done on Manusmriti and decolonizing Manusmriti, and all of the conflicting shlokas, they make it crystal clear that, hang on, this has been tampered with. And so anybody who genuinely wants to have a solution and progress made towards harmonious coexistence, they need to factor in and set in the context of colonial interpretations. We have to revisit this period, this red circle period, and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and make our own repairs to our own Shastra. The extent to which the British at that time told lies, you could not imagine that a society, a community would be so determined to lie. Many of us may have heard the expression that the sun never set on the British Empire because even God would not trust the British in the dark, as Rabindranath Tagore had said. The research that I've done, I was horrified that there was such a community so committed to misrepresenting, to lying, to concealing, purely and solely for acquiring wealth and then concealing the fact that they had acquired it. So that is work that needs to be done, and it's being done. I must admit, it's being done. I'm so impressed with the manner in which the newer generation who are accessing these works are working their way through. We have phenomenal work being done. It's only a question of time before we reintegrate our Shastras, our history, our Itihas with our lived experience.
Yes, and lived experience is also very important, and that actually brings out the other side, right? What about the lived experience of the people that actually face the boot of discrimination today in India? What about, how do we reconcile the two dialogues, right? We know that caste is a colonial concept, but the lived experiences, the reality on the ground is very different. You see in the news, sometimes you see in conversations with people of what's happening in India or what's happening in general around discrimination, right? How do you reconcile the two? How do you say, well, this is not part of Sanatana Dharma? I've always maintained that there is Hinduism and then there are Hindus. So they're two different, just like there are criminals and there are the religion, so they're different people. So your thoughts on that point?
It's vital that those who have been discriminated against to such a degree that their right to equal access of resources and opportunity is restored. Now, a fundamental stumbling block on that way is the constitutional provisions which were created to enshrine and preserve community friction. The constitutional provisions that, and indeed in the penal and civil code, they preserve injustice. And as long as injustice is not identity neutral, it will continue to exacerbate and harm people. Now, this is very, very important because we need to make sure that our legal frame is decolonized of all of these tropes in the first instance. The moment that's done, no political party will be able to leverage this colonialist construct in order to have political benefit. Unless we decolonize the political class's capacity to wield colonialist tropes for political profit and benefit today, we can't address the injustices that are endemic. So at this moment in time, there are equally unbelievably poor members of the Brahmin class, as they would be deemed by the caste system, who are devastated and have been devastated for many generations, and who exist on subsistence level salaries, existence and remuneration. They too need justice. And in the same way, at the other extreme of the caste system, there are those people who are denied opportunity of access to education, to employment, because of this colonialist trope. They too need to be supported. But it's clear that that support is economic. I've spoken with ministers in Bharat. I visited and had a wonderful engagement with Sri Jularamji, who is supposedly from a low caste environment. And one of the first things he said to me, he said, Satishji, in uplifting our communities, my problem is not caste anymore. My problem is the fabric of our communities, which is destroyed by evangelism. He said, this is my issue. We have got communities where we can work and we can give them economic empowerment, but the friction that is being created by people coming in from outside, how do we deal with this issue? So this is an equally fundamental issue. But I think if we can detoxify the political structures and the civil code and penal code of this colonialist trope, that's the beginning. Let's disempower politicians and prevent them from leveraging this identity politics, and then we can work towards harmonizing and supporting all of the community members we have.
Yeah, and I would say, Panditji, that's fantastic, and that will, that's a important step to take. We also have another challenge. We have the challenge of the so-called South Asian groups or the South Asian organizations, scholars, etc., who are hell-bent on keeping this caste bomb, in there, right, and continuing to use that caste bomb against our community in the under Hinduism, South Asian history, whatever you want to call it. What are your thoughts on dealing with that? Because as you see, every single lesson that you will ever see about India, Hinduism, in high schools, middle schools, even and then colleges, of course, has to have caste, right? So how do you deal with that part of it? Because that actually is, the political side will continue, but this is more ideological, right? And it grooms the young generation into thinking internalized guilt about, oh, we are so horrible and we need to get rid of this whole horrific thing by disbanding Hinduism. In 2019, at a conference in University of Michigan, one of the panelists actually said that we must destroy Hinduism to get rid of caste. Yeah. These are the exact words of the panelists. Yeah. And the fact that this person actually said that at an event organized by a South Asian department is just appalling.
So here are some thoughts which I'm going to put out there, and I'm really looking for an opportunity to defend these thoughts. They're going to be quite assertive. And that is that, as we have seen in Oxford University over the last few days, it's perfectly possible to have people who are articulate, literate, who have command over language and phrase, and yet are complete idiots who you wouldn't want anywhere near your family. We have to recognize that our understanding of education was the capacity to produce nobility in people. So number one, if there are people who are claiming to be educated and talking and having these conversations, but there's no trace of nobility, there's no sense that they are compassionate people wanting the well-being of everybody, then they need to be disempowered. Secondly, I spoke very clearly about an identity. We have a civilizational identity which spans over 20,000 years. And that civilizational identity is genuinely civilized. It is people who are civil. And that identity is defined by name. It's defined by name, it's defined by practice, it's defined by principle. And that identity is a threat to these adolescent identities which have dominance in the physical space at this moment in time. When we talk about Bharat, when we talk about Hindus, when we talk about India especially, it rankles with people who feel threatened by that civilizational identity. The Vishnu Puran identifies Bharat. It records that she who is crowned with the Himalayas and whose feet bathe at the junction of the oceans, that Bharat is my mother who I salute. Okay, that is a clear identity, and that challenges these groups who are fearful of it. That's why it's so important for them to talk about South Asia, because the more you dominate the conversation with South Asia, the less there is the defined characteristic of a Bharatiya identity. Right, so I welcome people who identify themselves as South Asian and who love that rhetoric, because it makes it clear for us as to who they are, where they stand, and what work needs to be done for them. They are people who I classified as useful idiots, and I would love to engage in a conversation with them, gently, lovingly, because to some degree, I think they are suffering from a trauma that they do not even realize has been inflicted upon them. Macaulay was very clear that the British identity, the colonialist identity, said this is what we want to produce. People who are brown, Hindu on the outside, but who adhere to our values on the inside. And so I would ask all of these people to reflect upon how much of their independent, self-directed existence is genuinely, authentically themselves, and how much is actually just pure conditioning. So yes, I would love to have a conversation, and I would love to hear them rebut my charge that they are acting as useful idiots.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a
That
very good
was
term.
that was challenging enough. I mean, how more? What else could I do to throw down the gauntlet and invite a conversation?
Yeah, no, we should be doing that. We'll do that more and more. And this is just the beginning of our conversation, as you know, Panditji. Now, let's talk about Ambedkarji. Okay, there was a question that people asked. Okay, related to the South Asian activists and others, they use a lot of Ambedkarji's work to talk about the whole caste idea and how Hinduism is so bad and it must be dismantled, destroyed, things like this. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, most people who talk about Ambedkar, very few of them have actually done a unemotional, fairly critical analysis of the complete work that he produced. Right? The charge that Ambedkar hated Hinduism, it really needs to be scrutinized, but there's a more important charge that needs to be considered. He was an incredible individual. He was a masterful constitutional lawyer. He had understood what he wanted to incorporate. And I recall he inserted the concept that it's better that one criminal go free than any other person suffers an injustice. What a wonderful principle. Now, had he genuinely not been conditioned by the colonialist tropes that were pretty much pervading the whole conversation at that time, if he'd applied that principle, he would never have allowed any group of any community to actually be on the receiving end of constitutional injustice. He would never have allowed the edict that he put in for the benefit of the crushed groups, as they called themselves, to be capable of enshrining a similar sort of crushing experience for other groups purely innocently. And the issue of how Ambedkarji has been woven into this dialogue and how he has been appropriated into this dialogue, how much of what he had written has been conveniently sidelined in this dialogue in its own right is a conversation worth having. But it's crystal clear that he never had any intention to destroy or uproot Sanatan Dharma. He had every intention of challenging the concept of Hinduism as had been sculpted by the British rhetoric for over 200 years. Gandhiji repeatedly speaks of getting rid of the caste system. They did not speak of getting rid of the Varna, Kul, Jati, Parampara, Bradari system. And so we have to separate the two. Yes, everybody at that time wanted to get rid of the caste system, but not the system that's so beautifully described by Dharmpalji and so many others. We have to decolonize the Ambedkar identity as well.
Yeah, we do. A lot of work in front of us. Now let's sort of shift a little bit. We're running out of time. A few things. There are interests of people wanting to set up some interviews as a follow-up with some TV channels or media and outlets and stuff like that. Yeah. So we'll work on that with you and see how we can get that in some of the mainstream channels and have this conversation. Naturally, in the way I look at it in America versus in the UK, the whole idea of colonialism and everything has, it's much more matured. The conversation much more matured in the UK than it is in the US. Only now there's a lot more conversation happening around the racism, colonialism, amplified, I'm saying. But yet the colonialism part does not include the Hindus or the Indians in general, right? So that's what we have to kind of plant. There's a movement of Stop Asian Hate, and I can tell you there is the Hindu voice or the Indian American voice within that is very, very small, and that's a fault of our community because we don't take advantage of the movements that are around us to join them and to kind of promote what we are facing as well. So interview absolutely is going to be something that people want.
If I can just pick you up on that one point, because it's so important. We did it here in the United Kingdom, right? This issue had been bubbling along in the background for the best part of a decade. And here in the United Kingdom, we taught the true history of what was done to Bharat by the British to the British. And they accepted that in fact this issue was so toxic because the revelations that we brought to them about what their immediate ancestors had done to us was a shock to them. They genuinely had no idea. And when we educated them, they became our partners in making sure that this injustice wasn't perpetuated. You have to do the same in the USA. You have to make these people who don't know the full story our own partners in preventing this injustice. And it can be done. The information in the book, nobody so far has been able to refute any of it. You know, I presented it to parliamentarians in the upper chamber, the lower chamber. I presented it at Lambeth Palace to the Christian evangelical missions, and not a single person has managed to undermine the contents of the book. So the information is all there. The only thing that's necessary is for a group of people to present it, to package it, and to deploy it in a manner which is suitable for the situation on the ground in the United States. And it can be done. And the colonialist aspect is key and fundamental to this conversation.
Yep, good stuff. The second thing is, how can people buy your book besides Amazon? Is there a way for like your website or Garuda Prakashan or somewhere else that you can either point to or partner with and stuff like that? Any suggestions on that?
So we would do that. I must admit that the Amazon environment is incredibly convenient. And I'm one of those people, like I said, I didn't want 10,000 copies and 48 beautiful trees converted into weight on the surface of the earth to sit around without appreciation and understanding. So we took the shortest route to market, which was to put it up on Amazon as print on demand. And so that's the most convenient. And I suspect that's actually the most economical as well. We are going to do this work though. In Bharat, I'm in conversation with publishers, and I would love to have a conversation with publishers in Bharat to make this readily available. Now, how we do it outside of Bharat is a conversation about economics, about costs, and all of that sort of stuff. And if there's somebody who is happy to do that and join me in trying to clarify that as a project and making it economically viable, I'm more than happy to make it available in any way, shape, or form. I really wanted speed to market on this, and I knew that if it was on Amazon, anybody with Kindle Unlimited could read the book free of charge. That anybody with access to Amazon could have the book printed on demand within 3 or 4 days. It's more important that the information gets out there quickly than I've got no desire to be #1 New York bestseller or whatever it is. I just want it out there in as vast numbers as we can, and let's get some people reading and working with the material. It's raw material. With it, anybody can start these projects and can take control of this issue at any level, whether it's within legislation or whether it's at a community and familial level. So I'm open to whatever we can do to make sure that this reaches the people who want to work with the knowledge and the information in there.
Yep, and that's why we started this Decolonize campaign. We talked about this maybe a couple of months ago of how we can approach it. We're waiting for your book to be launched, and now that it's here, this is a great opportunity for us to formally go forward and do many of the types of things that we're doing today. Conversations, presentations, workshops, many different ways of approaching this, creating clips, videos, infographics, so many things to do. So whoever's interested in helping in this project, you can contact us at info@cohna.org. We're definitely looking forward to working with Panditji on many other things coming up. We're going to go on for a long time, but we appreciate everyone's opportunity to join today. And Satishji, as always, it's a pleasure having you and learning from you and learning with you as we go in this journey together.
If I can take this opportunity to congratulate you on the success of the New York swastik work that you did, and we had the pleasure of being a small part of. Well done. And that's a great example of what happens when we share our narrative into a space which has no notion of the perspectives that we bring to the table. So congratulations to everybody who worked on that, and it was a real pleasure to be a part of it. Finally, if I can just say, everybody who's been watching this, as soon as we conclude, make a decision on what you're going to do. What you're going to do about this. Knowing is not enough. Being free of the blemish of caste is not enough. We have to take a step, make something happen, bring change about. And I would ask everyone, please, I'm trying to do this work. and I need the voice to be amplified. And so you can certainly get in touch. My Twitter handle is there. The British Hindu is very easy to remember, and my name is my domain. So please do take advantage of those, get in touch, let's connect, and let's start this work happening.
Excellent, Panditji. Namaskar. And I wanted to say thank you for everybody who joined us today, the viewers who are watching live on Facebook, as well as the attendees on the webinar. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Thank you for your wonderful insights, Panditji, as always, and looking forward to more conversations around this topic.
Om Tat Sat.
Hari Om.
Hari Om.